R4 and what next after R4. So I'm going to talk about 4 things. I'm going to talk a little about some of what's changed in R4, what's new, what's coming. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it means to have a normative specification, because R4 is our first normative specification. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about dealing with multiple FHIR versions, since more and more all of us have to do that. And then finally I'm going to talk about what's going to follow after R4 is released. So let's talk about timelines. When I started working on FHIR, we thought it would be really simple and easy. So much for that. We thought that we would pump out a couple of trial use versions. Everybody would converge on those, and then we'd release a formal standard that everybody would use. It hasn't worked like that. So what has happened is that if you're a long timer with the spec, you'll know that there's some parts that changed a lot initially. And then as we converged as a community on something that worked, which is always a compromise between different stakeholders, it started to change less. And then it changed even less. And finally, it's just too hard to change. Nobody wants to change. Even if someone comes, and periodically some of the people in this room propose something that's actually better than what we have, but it's too late. It's not good enough, better enough to justify the change. So, but as new things have been added to the standard, they go through that process themselves in their own speed. And so we're never going to have a spec that's ready for normative, which I'll get to what that means, but basically means stable. Things that have been there from the beginning, some of those are ready to be stable, and other things have been added and they're on their own time course. So it became clear that we would start bringing parts of the specification stable, not the whole specification. And then we started working with the goal of publishing release 4 with a normative base, which we call it at the end of this year. So it's my goal is to publish release 4 before Christmas. We'll see how that goes. But it's a big personal goal, because for those of us in the core who actually work on the standard, our lives consist of really 2 totally different phases. One is where the standard is out there, it's being engaged with, we have lots of opportunity to engage with implementations and to actually make consulting money, which is most of us make our money, and most of the core anyway, the core team. And then we turn back and go through the actual slide of producing a standard, and that becomes all encompassing, and we don't have time. And so I can see my income go like this with the standard. So I kind of have a really strong motivation to get the thing out the door, so I can go back and actually start saying to family, actually this is all worth something for some reason or other. So our goal is to publish by the end of this year. And since I still have no projector, let me see where we are. We'll go back when we get projector to some of the things I actually want to show you. But if you look, I went through the spec overnight to check that I was fully up to date. The spec that is published on build.fhir.org, the current version, that's actually candidate stable version. Right? It's got all of the breaking changes are in, all of the trivial changes are in, all the narrative fix-ups. It's now going through QA, final checking, final process. This does not look encouraging. So you can all go and look at it and give it final QA. Please do that. And please, I hope that you don't find anything badly broken. But if you do, I would rather you tell me now than sometime later. So we are at the point where you can all see what is going to be published. It's ready to go. So we've made a few changes. We allow exponential form for decimals. So straight away, we're talking pretty small stuff, pretty edge case, corner stuff. Actually, that one wasn't very small. That one cost me a lot implementing that one across all the way through the tools and my server and everything. It's kind of a sting in the tail, that one, but it's a really narrow case. Well, we're getting somewhere. Cool. So, and now this doesn't work, but that's okay. I can deal with that. All right. So, that was okay. The first thing I want to show you is at the bottom of every page, there's a little link here, compare to DSTU3. Okay, that will go to a W3C diff service, so we'll give you a diff between the version 3 page and the version 4 page. That is authoritative as to what's changed in the spec. It's just a straight HTML diff agent. Okay, so back to here. We added canonical data type. We reworked the money type. We added ref type to reference data type. We made some clarifications around multi-language support, none of which actually affected the wire format. They're just recommendations. We made some clarifications around modifiers and modifier extensions. We added a few FHIR path functions, and we specified a formal definition of use of cross-version extensions. Those, other than the decimal thing, they're really off in the corners. It tells you where we are with the stable base of the spec. Not a lot of changes. When it comes to resources, we publish, as part of the resource, a list of changes that have happened in the resource between release 3 and release 4. So you can see this is Encounter, which I chose as a relatively manageable example. Some of them, like Patient, have hardly any changes at all, but we've added elements, we've renamed elements, we've added types, changed cardinalities, got rid of stuff. That's the last part of the spec that's not stable, is the comparison between release 4 and release 3. What we did, we stabilised everything else, and a group of us are going through now and working on the comparison and making sure the comparison's correct. The comparison is partially tool generated, but the tool doesn't know about renaming, and so we're going through manually picking up renames and telling the tool about that. We added GraphQL support. If you've done any work with FHIR, you'll know that it's a pretty chatty protocol, lots and lots of exchange between servers and clients. GraphQL is a pretty cool way to get more from the server in a single go. We added bulk data support for the other problem, which is moving large amounts of data around, asynchronous queries, bulk data, ability to ask for a lot of data. We've added a bunch of new content in the specification around different kind of supporting healthcare data. We're considering at the moment supporting the medication registration process, which is a legal regulatory process around registering new medications. And you'll see that in the bottom right-hand corner of the resource page. A big set of really complicated resources for saying absolutely everything that there could be said ever about a medication. And we've put a lot of work into definition process and providing a lot more underlying support. Most users who use FHIR, they just go, here's a resource, here's an API, bingo. But as you get more and more breadth in your implementation, you deal with more and more use cases, you start saying, hang on, I want a bit more infrastructural support for consistency, for reflection, processing, and so I want more out of the spec, and that's where you start running into some of these underlying definitional patterns, which are all there in computable form, so you can start leveraging those one way or another. That's something you grow into. Okay, so in the core of the spec, we're not changing very much anymore, and we're changing less and less, and things are getting fixed. I want to talk about that. But in the different resource areas, the different resources, some of those are completely transformed to the point where I who do most of the release 3 to release 4 transformations, I look at them and go, you can't transform this. The committee has changed its mind about how things work. And that's typically happens with the very immature resources that are still figuring out what they are. So you've got to keep a really close eye on the maturity level of the things you're dealing with. Okay, now let's talk about normative. So a normative specification is an American word, which means that the specification is a formal standard, and that comes with, first of all, a bunch of procedural requirements to ensure that everybody gets a say, everybody has a veto of it, and it's really hard for us to push it across the line. It's taken years to get to that point. And once it's across the line, we don't make breaking changes to it, so that you can rely on the standard. Now, you guys have written any code, you'll know that breaking changes is kind of a slippery concept. So what we say is that in practice we want forwards compatibility. You often hear it called backwards compatibility, but it's not. It's forwards compatibility. An application that is conformant to release 4, normative parts of release 4 should be conformant to release 5. Right? And anybody can say, when we're looking at release 5 in the future, oh, no, it's not. And that's a problem. And so we're committed to making that the case. If you implement an application that only implements release 4 normative specification parts, it will be solid as a rock going forwards. But there's some provisos around that. If your application is receiving data and it's rejecting unknown elements, then when you get a release 5 resource, you'll reject that. There's nothing we can do about that. So if you have an application that rejects unknown elements, it's not safe going forwards. And there's some aspects of the specification we don't really know how it works, around terminology and terminology bindings, different codes, what's the rules between versions, what would make your application not workable anymore. We don't know about that. The other thing is that those rules don't apply to external content, SNOMED content or ICD or LOINC or whatever. They got their own rules that we don't control them. And also we have a special case where if we look at something and say, you know what, it's just broken. We did call it normative, but nobody's used it. Nobody objects to changing it. Then we'll still make breaking changes, but we will consult really widely about that. Oops, something started working. All right, so that's normative. All right. Now I want to tell you a little bit about introversion support. Most of us will end up in a situation where we're dealing with more than one version of FHIR. I reckon these are crossed because it's not working for me and that someone else is flicking them over. This is kind of fun. I'm just going to unplug this, that'll sort that out. All right, someone else is in another room going, what? I'll put that down then. Okay, all right. Okay, supporting multiple versions. Classically we've said, hey, there's a client, there's a server, they know what the version they're talking about, they agree in advance, and that's all they need to know. And then we do release 2 or release 3 or release 4. In practice it's not so simple. So there's 3 different ways that you can deal with having multiple versions in use. The first and simplest is the formalization of what I just said. The FHIR version in the capability statement defines what's in use. If you want to know what version of FHIR a particular resource is, you say, well, what was the capability statement for the server that I got the resource from? What is the version this server I'm talking to? And so that's the definition for the FHIR version element. I go to a server, I say, hey server, give me a capability statement. The server says, hey, I'm release 3 or I'm release 4. It will actually say 3.0.1 or 4.0, whatever. Those of you who are long enough in FHIR will know that's kind of self-referential, since if you're in release 2, you would get a different kind of resource back. So it's got limits, but that's the simplest way. And I gotta tell you, people like to complicate version stuff, and it's complicated enough. I highly recommend that you do this as much as you can get away with. All right, and so most people have implemented different APIs, not just FHIR, but FHIR as well, with different versions on different endpoints. So if you're at acme.com, you have an R3 endpoint, an R2 endpoint, an R4 endpoint, And each of those endpoints is known version. And that's nice and simple. And lots of people are doing that right now. You go to different endpoints, you get different capability statements, and away you go. But it does have one issue, which is that one underlying record has different URLs, even though it's the same underlying concept. And that's got its own problems, particularly if you're trying to be RESTful, that's not so good. So it's possible to have the same endpoint. And so in this case, acme.com/FHIR serves all versions. How that works is the client chooses a version and says, fetch me this version for that, and it will use FHIR version as a parameter on the MIME type. And then say, okay, we're going to talk FHIR release 3, because it's version 3. And that means the whole interaction is versioned, not just the version of the resource. So the headers, the search parameters, they'll all have the same version. You can't say, except for one special case I'll get to later, you can't say, hey, I want to request, here's a release 2 resource, but I'm talking release 3 search parameters and transaction paradigms and so forth. So you can't mix it like that. The client, there's a special operation which I didn't put on my slides for the client to ask the server what versions it supports at a given endpoint. It's a versions operation, and it gets back a little list. These are the versions I support at this endpoint. This is my default version I'm going to use if you don't specify a version. So if you want to put up a multi-version server, that's how you do it. You use the FHIR version parameter. Almost all other places that resources travel, whether they're in batches or they're in version 2 messages or they're carried inside X12 messages in the States or whatever, there's a MIME type, most places. And so you can use the version parameter on the MIME type to say, well, I know how to read this version, this resource, I know what version it is. There's no support, we don't have any support for mixing different versions within a bundle. A bundle is versioned, and the whole interaction is versioned. But there's still some people for whom that set of options is still not enough, and they want to mark specifically inside a resource what version of FHIR the resource is. This is really difficult, and anybody who's worked with version 2 knows about this. In order to figure out what you're reading, you have to read the version so that you can figure out how to read it so you can find the version. And it used to be really simple. You'd count X number of vertical bars in, and you take the next 4 characters. But over time, life has got much more complicated, and reading version 2 messages has turned into a real art form if you're actually writing a single parser that'll parse version 2 messages without a known version. And so it's kind of tricky with FHIR as well. We can put in, I think inside the message, say this is the version you're reading, but you're basically going to end up parsing the message twice. Once to find out what the version is, and then once to actually parse the resource. So here's how you actually mark the resource. This is a bit sort of inelegant at first sight, but it has real benefits. You say, here's a patient, and it's an R3 patient, because it conforms to the R3 structure. The really cool thing is, with patient, you could have a patient that conforms to R2, R3, and R4 already, if you only use the bits that were conserved consistently across them. And you could mark it. So this is an R2 patient, and an R3 patient, and an R4 patient. That's the really great thing about doing it this way, even though it's a little bit more complicated. So you can mark a resource inside the resource to say what versions it conforms to. I encourage you not to do that, but if you have to do it, you have to do it. All right. Now I'm talking about handling change between versions. So you've got a system that's doing R3, and someone says, oh, I want to start doing R4, or you've got maybe you're meeting the Argonaut spec, and you've got mandatory R2 set of resources for dealing on the patient API, but you're also doing the healthcare directory API, which is R3. You've got multiple versions in flight. In some fantasy world, they're entirely separate APIs that don't run into each other. But that's not the real world. So, first thing, once a resource goes normative, You can just say, I'll ignore stuff I don't know about, and I'm confident that my implementation will be fine, because we all keep it that way. So if you implement an R4 patient, you can say, I'm going to ignore anything that's I don't know about. I'm just going to read R4 patient attributes, elements, properties. I don't worry about version change anymore. Unless, of course, we introduce some new feature in patient that you actually care about, in which case you have to care about. Then you can actually convert. So I'm seeing a number of, so this is a pretty common architecture for me to see now. You put up an API which allows clinical systems, this is kind of a clinical data repository API. You allow clinical systems to push resources at the clinical data repository. There's a release 2 and a release 3 and a release 4 API. And as they come in, first of all, you store them as you receive them in the version you received them in an audit, basically an audit-ready database. So people can go, if they really want, they can see exactly how you received them. And then you convert them into your common clinical data repository, which is in whichever version you choose it to be in. And the main CDR interface is on that version. So I'm actually starting to see quite a few systems running exactly that way. And basically you convert before or after you've chosen how to store them. And there's also lots of systems now where you've got your own persistence model and you've just got 2 parallel stacks for release 2 and release 3 and another one for release 4. And then it doesn't matter which language you choose, it's the same underlying information. So that's pretty straightforward. I can't tell you which is the right way for a particular project because every project's got different constraints around storage and dynamic behavior and accountabilities, some combination of those patterns. I do want to talk about how you can convert resources. So there's basically 3 ways to do the conversion. So the first is there's a set of Java code. That's the class name of the Java code. It's in our GitHub repository. It's got standalone Java code, which I maintain to convert between release 3 and release 4 resources, converts both directions. The way that happens is when I cut R5 in the few weeks after we've released R4, I will regenerate. I generate using code I wrote to generate Java code that just transforms between them. And over the year and a half, as people make changes to resources, I just go through and update that code. It's one of the hardest parts of FHIR for me is maintaining that code. And so you take a resource in release 4 format and convert it to release 3 format. Now that code, it's tricky, that code includes every resource that was in R3 as long as I have the patience to deal with the transform. Sometimes I just go, I don't know what's going on here and I don't have time because it's always time critical, so I just comment some lines out. And sometimes I go, I'm sick of this resource, it's changing too much, the committee's all over the place, and I just comment the whole resource out or even delete it right out. So I don't defend every resource. I defend these resources. They are 100% correct and we depend on them internally. Everything else is you take your chances, although contributions are welcome if people want to contribute. And there are a number of applications running that code in production. I assume that they've done their checking and they know what they're doing. Right? So you're welcome to use that code, and you're welcome to use that code for any resources, but I personally only commit to maintaining that code, because it's costly code, for those particular resources. But contributions are welcome. I also maintain that code in Pascal as well, for me. Okay, but that code is not, for me, the primary definition of the conversion between the resources. It's maintained for my convenience. Our internal publishing infrastructure can jump up and around the versions seamlessly because I maintain this code. But it's for us, it's only about our internal publishing infrastructure, those resources. Then we publish the FHIR4 maps. So here's a FHIR mapping language, which is also on the subject here this week. We provide that for every resource that exists in both release 3 and release 4. And I'm currently, now that release 4 is finalised, I'm going through with a few other volunteers and actually checking those. We actually have a round trip unit testing code, and about a third of the resources have been fully updated. They will be subject to ongoing maintenance. If you use them, we will commit to maintaining those, and we care about them. Unlike the Java code for the other resources, which I will just randomly comment stuff out. Won't do that in these. So the FHIR mapping language is FHIR mapping language. It's able to be used as an authoritative definition of the relationship between a release 3 and a release 4 resource. Or we will comment if we just can't convert things at all. And we'll explain why we have done that or not. So it accounts for every possible data, conformant data value that will be converted. And that means that it's pretty complicated and rich language because it counts for every possibility. So you can use it as an authoritative, human-readable statement of the relationship of transform between the two. You can use existing conversion engines, and there's a couple of open source ones, and I know that there's some commercial ones. And then you can translate it to some other language. Robert Warden maintains a translator to translate it to Java code, but it would be possible to write other translations as well. If you're interested in that, Vadim and I are going to try, Vadim from FHIR and I are going to try and do an informal session around working on these as a volunteer in the next few weeks to get them nailed for publication. Then there's the convert operation. You can use a server to convert. So this is the one case where you can mix versions on a single operation. So there's an operation defined in FHIR, the FHIR spec itself, called convert. You post a resource to the convert endpoint, and you say what it is that you're posting and what you want to get back. In this case, this example saying, here's a release 4.3 version of a resource, give me the release 4 version. You have to be prepared to get a bundle back if the resource has been changed into 2 different resources. That happens, but you will get back what we think is the right conversion. And then that's going to be bundled in the next happy release. At least I think it is. James kind of said maybe, but we haven't actually done it yet. But then you will be able to run the happy CLI locally and just get the conversion from one resource to another. If it's one of the defended resources, I will use that server will use the Java conversion. Otherwise, it'll use the FHIR4 Maps. And then you could just run that locally in infrastructure and just get it converted on the fly. And we will keep updating the maps as we roll forwards. All right. So what follows release 4? We will start work on release 5 immediately, which actually means not for a few months, because we all need to have a break. And in fact, as I said, we have that 2-phase process, one where we actually focus on implementation and building community and actually making use of the FHIR specification. And then when we turn back and start focusing on the spec itself. So it's possible with the first normative version and a whole bunch of regulatory things around the world will push everybody to converge on release 4. And so then we'll be focused as a community on making release 4 our main focus. And so later next year, we're going to go back to the community and say, well, what kind of timeline do you want us to push release 5 out with? Do you want us to just push it out as quick as possible? Or do you want us to wait? And actually, when we did release 2, we went to the community with the same question with release 3. And initially they said, wait, we're not doing anything more. And then a few months later, they came back to us and said, can we get back into release 3 and get going? So we'll keep surveying the market on that. But mainly our focus will be around consolidating community, building solutions, making really useful things with FHIR. So I'll finish up with my personal agenda with FHIR. I set out to do 3 things: to refactor healthcare IT, standards to refactor healthcare IT and to refactor health. Refactoring healthcare IT standards is pretty much done. Even the standards that are not FHIR, which include lots of really good standards, they've changed the way they operate to be much more implementation focused, community focused, make it work focused. That's a great thing for everybody. So we kind of like look at that and say we've refactored healthcare IT standards. We're not done with FHIR, but we're done with refactoring the way healthcare IT standardization works. Healthcare IT is an ecosystem, vendors, solutions. We're not done with that, but you can see that by and large the community is sliding to a new place, more open, more value for money. It's not always to the liking of everybody in the community, but that's the way open source works. Open source floats a bottom line. You can't sell anything to the market that's worse than open source because it's free. So open source is the bottom of the market. As it floats up, everybody either gets better or they fall off. And that's what's happening, starting to happen now in healthcare IT, right? There's no way, the only way to survive is to get better. The real job is to refactor healthcare. That is much harder. That's not really yet happening. It's starting to see it coming. All right, I'll stop there and take questions. There's one at the back.
So that list of resources, the 8 resources that you're defending.
Yep.
My small question is, should bundle be in there?
Oh yeah,
Maybe. Anyway.
Bundle includes everything else, so it's kind of, yeah, but bundle's on the list, yes.
Yeah. Do you see that growing for things like implementation guide moving forwards?
Well, implementation guide was on the list.
Oh, you're right. Okay. Do you
parameters is actually
kind of infrastructural things?
Parameters is on the list, but it exists to support my publishing requirements.
Yep.
If somebody else chooses to stand up and say I'm going to defend some other resources, that'd be great. Very happy with that, but I won't be. Thanks. Any other questions?
Hi. I'm curious what your thoughts are on minor releases. Is R4 pretty much R4 and always going to be R4, or are there going to be minor releases before R5?
Okay, that's a good question. We may do, and almost certainly will, ballot some point releases around changes around the stuff that's less mature and changing more quickly. We haven't formally figured out quite how we'll handle that. In the past, they kind of slipped out as point releases, but they haven't had any long-standing, well, mostly they haven't really, made it into the market. They're just a chance for us to have a milestone to look at. That might change now because we're really going to start having content at different speeds, and we could do point releases. Version 4 or release 4 as is will never be changed. We would release, and we have done this in the past for release 3 and release 2, we've released very specific point fixes to warn people about security issues or something, but we've never made any changes and we don't have a structure to make any changes. If you're implementing release 4, it's release 4, end of story. But we might have subsequent patch releases, minor releases for, let's say we will probably drop out. If you look at the build.fire.org right now, there's a bunch of really brand new resources around evidence-based medicine. I think those will be a huge deal in the long term because you'll be able to actually say, here's our evidence, here's the kind of evidence we need, here's our database, here's the evidence, here's our actual, the way we practice medicine and become computable. Magic. Big deal. Long project. We're probably going to drop those out of the formal release 4 release. But they're kind of cool and they're kind of important and they're kind of rolling over pretty quickly. And so we might do patches to bring them back in after we've done the formal release 4 release. A 4.4, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. So it's possible. We don't know.
Thank you.
Question down here.
You had a slide on the workflow process. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? You had a slide on workflow. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Which slide was that?
This one.
This one?
Yes.
We're still working through what it means to model clinical workflows, and to the degree that we should do that in the standard versus just provide language for people to say what they're doing in implementation. Workflow is tricky, and has always been the hardest thing for us to nail down. Most of the business process modeling languages are too precise for healthcare. All of us who actually model healthcare processes know they're full of what ifs and maybes and special cases and emergency fallbacks, BPMN and stuff. They just don't have that, and they're a fail. So there's some new interesting language work coming out of some research institutions associated with FHIR around workflow modeling, but it's still really, really early. So it's kind of, we've provided some more support for modeling it this time and some more language for dealing with it, but I think that it's still work in progress, and probably something we'll be looking at much more harder in release 5. But we have added some stuff. I shouldn't be specific here and now. Sorry. Oh, one more question. Next to them, sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could say something about how the conformance resources will change or not in R4 going forward, since it sort of fixes the whole framework for everything else. Are they going to have, say, special rules or have a different logic governing changes, or are they just going to be sort of forever fixed? Or
so if you look at the structure definition, value set, code system, operation definition, and search parameter, I think, are all normative when we publish release 4. No more changes unless they're forwards compatible. Gives us a stable base. We've invested really deeply in those to make them stable, and it's probably taken about a quarter of my time over the last 3 years to deal with changes in those. And so they'll be stable. Implementation guide, painful but not quite stable yet. We want to move on, right? We want to say done. Now we're focusing on tools and to support users rather than keeping on navel gazing on our own internal infrastructure, which is effectively what that is. So as much as possible, we'll be stabilizing and freezing that, and I'll be very hostile to grand new ideas for how to do things. Doesn't mean they won't happen, but I'm going to be hostile to them. All right, thank you very much. That brings us to time.